The air in the studio was unusually heavy that evening. The lights were dimmed low, and Judge Judy's voice carried a gravity that silenced everyone who dared to breathe too loudly. Across from her sat King Charles, his face pale, his eyes distant, and a strange stillness surrounding him as if he had rehearsed this moment for years but never truly believed it would come. The cameras rolled. The red light blinked on, and the world leaned in to listen. She began softly, "Your Majesty, the rumors about your statements regarding Islam, are they true?" A faint smile crossed his face, not of amusement, but of exhaustion, his hands clasped tightly on his lap as he exhaled, eyes flickering toward the camera. "Truth," he said, voice almost trembling, "has a way of haunting those who try to hide it." The audience shifted uneasily. Judge Judy leaned forward. "So you did say it." He nodded slowly, not once, but many times, though never the way the world heard it. There was a silence so complete that even the hum of the microphones felt intrusive. Then he continued, his tone darkening. "You see, I've studied faith all my life, not for politics, not for ceremony, but for understanding. And the more I learned, the more I realized Islam isn't what they told us it was." Judge Judy blinked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." King Charles took a long pause, his gaze lowering. "When I was a young prince, I spent nights reading about the Prophet Muhammad, about justice, mercy, the balance of nature and faith. There was wisdom there, something ancient, pure, and misunderstood. And yet, every time I mentioned it publicly, they called it dangerous." He looked up again, his expression hollow. They wanted a king who bowed only to tradition, not truth. A shiver ran through the room. The camera zoomed in on his face, creased with years of restraint, of secrets buried beneath royal duty. "There are things," he whispered, "that this family was never meant to question. But I did, and that was my greatest mistake." Judge Judy's tone grew sharper. "Are you saying you were silenced?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Silenced, no, groomed, conditioned, made to understand that certain truths were unprofitable." He shifted in his seat. "The world thrives on division, Your Honor. Peace doesn't sell newspapers. Fear does." Her eyes stayed locked on him. "And what about now? Why speak about it again?" He leaned forward, his voice almost trembling. "Because I'm tired of pretending. I've seen what they do in the name of control, how they twist faiths into tools of manipulation. Islam was never the enemy. Ignorance was." The audience gasped faintly, some whispering among themselves, but King Charles wasn't done. His tone became darker, heavier, as if recalling something buried deep within the palace walls. "There was a night," he said, "after my mother's passing, I was alone in Balmoral, walking through the corridors she once ruled. I found her old writings, letters never meant for the public. In one of them, she mentioned meeting an imam decades ago. She wrote, 'There is a light in his words I cannot explain. If only the world understood what we have misunderstood.'" He stopped for a moment, his jaw tightening. Even she knew. A Judge Judy sat back, her usual composure softening for a moment. "What are you trying to tell us, Your Majesty?" He looked straight into the camera, his voice almost breaking. "That history has been rewritten more times than scripture. That faiths have been demonized to protect power. And that maybe, just maybe, the truth about Islam, about compassion, about humanity itself, has been buried beneath centuries of fear." A long silence followed. The sound engineer didn't dare move. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. He continued, his voice now low and fragile. "When I visited Cairo years ago, I met a scholar. He told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'A true king seeks truth, not obedience.' And that haunted me, because I realized perhaps I had served obedience all my life, not truth." He rubbed his temples as if trying to ease a memory that refused to fade. "When I returned to London, I spoke about tolerance, about learning from Islam's wisdom. The next morning, I received a call from a man whose name I will never speak. He said, 'Your words were beautiful, Charles. But remember, beauty can be dangerous when it shines in the wrong direction.' His eyes glistened with restrained tears. From that day on, every speech I gave was filtered, every thought revised, every mention of unity written into neutrality." The audience sat frozen. Judge Judy's face had changed from skepticism to something closer to pity. "You sound like a man burdened by his own truth," she said quietly. He nodded, his voice almost gone. "I am. Because truth once known never lets you rest." He looked down at his hands again. "I remember the day I was crowned. The weight of the crown wasn't gold, it was guilt. The church bells rang, the people cheered, but in my heart, I knew I was celebrating a lie that had lived too long." The lights flickered slightly in the studio. A shadow passed over his face, and for a moment it felt as if history itself was listening. He leaned closer to the microphone, speaking in a whisper that pierced the silence. "There will come a day when the world will see Islam not as a threat but as a mirror. And when that day comes, I fear it will be too late for the empire, for the monarchy, for all of us." Judge Judy looked at him speechless. The silence was deafening. Then, with trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note. He placed it gently on the table. "These are her words," he said, referring to the late queen. "Words the palace never allowed to be read aloud." He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the fading ink. Then he read in a near whisper, "Faith, in all its forms, was meant to unite mankind. But man, in all his pride, made it a weapon." By a tear slipped down his cheek. That was her truth. And now it's mine. The studio lights dimmed further. No one spoke. The air felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of centuries. When the broadcast ended, the producer sat stunned. The cameras were turned off, but the silence lingered. Outside, the night over London was eerily still, somewhere in the distance. The bells of Westminster tolled, a sound that once meant power, now echoing like a requiem. And in that haunting silence, one truth remained, the kind of truth that doesn't fade with time, the kind that waits, the kind that watches. The bells of Westminster faded into the cold London night, their echoes dissolving into the damp mist that clung to the city like an unspoken confession. Inside the studio, the silence had turned into something sacred. No one moved, no one spoke. King Charles remained seated, eyes lowered, the old note from his mother trembling slightly between his fingers. The world outside had not yet seen what had just happened, but in that room everyone felt it. Something irreversible had been said. Judge Judy exhaled softly, breaking the stillness. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "are you aware of what you've just done?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the paper as though it still held the warmth of her hand. "For the first time in my life," he said, voice quiet but certain, "I've done something real." The producers whispered among themselves, panic rippling through the crew. One of them rushed to the control room muttering, "We'll need clearance before this airs." But another voice, older and trembling, said, "If this doesn't air, history won't forgive us." Charles slowly rose from his chair, the movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. "You cannot bury the truth forever," he murmured, half to himself, half to the ghosts that seemed to linger in the corners of the room. Judge Judy watched him, her usual steel now softened by something deeper, pity, perhaps even admiration. "Truth is a heavy crown, Your Majesty," she said. He smiled faintly, "and yet far lighter than the one I wear." He turned and walked out, no entourage, no guards, just the sound of his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Outside, London's air tasted of rain and smoke. The city was asleep, but its secrets never were. As Charles stepped into the waiting car, a single camera flash cut through the night. Someone had seen him. Someone had recorded his face at that exact moment. The burden of centuries etched into his eyes. He sat in silence as the car drove toward Clarence House. Streetlights flickered past like memories brief and fleeting. His reflection in the window looked older, almost ghostly. The words he had spoken played again in his mind, every syllable feeling heavier than the one before. When he arrived, the palace gates creaked open, slow and reluctant. As though even the metal sensed the unease, the guards saluted, unaware that they were greeting a man who had just shattered the unspoken code of a dynasty. Inside his study, the fire was still burning. The portraits of kings and queens stared down from the walls, watchful, disapproving, eternal. He stood before them, feeling their silent judgment. "I did what you never dared," he whispered. "I spoke." He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling slightly as it hit the glass. He stared into it, seeing not his reflection, but hers, the queen, in one of her quiet smiles. The kind the world never saw. He could almost hear her voice again, soft and resolute. "There is strength in truth, Charles. But beware, truth rarely serves the throne." He sank into the chair by the fire, the warmth offering no comfort. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, low and ominous. Somewhere deep within the palace walls, an old clock ticked with unnerving precision. Then came the knock. 3 short raps, measured, rehearsed. Not a servant, not a friend. He didn't answer immediately. "Come in," he said at last, his tone hollow. The door opened and a man entered, tall in a dark overcoat. His expression unreadable. He didn't bow, he didn't smile. "Your Majesty," he said with calm precision, "we need to discuss the interview." Charles studied him. "Ah," he said, taking a sip, "so word travels faster than light in this palace." The man stepped closer. "It's not just the palace, sir. The recording's already in circulation. Someone leaked a portion before the broadcast. It's spreading online." Charles raised an eyebrow, not in fear, but almost in then perhaps truth has better wings than I imagine. The man's eyes darkened. "You've caused quite a disturbance." "Parliament's already been alerted. MI5 is involved. They're calling it a breach of national stability." "Stability," Charles muttered, setting down the glass. "What a fragile illusion, sir." The man continued, "There are forces that will not tolerate this kind of rhetoric, not from the king. You've touched a line that's been drawn in blood for centuries." Charles leaned back, unfazed. "Then perhaps it's time someone smudged that line." The man hesitated, then placed a sealed folder on the table. "You'll need to read this. It concerns historical archives related to your mother's letters. The Crown archives have been reclassified effective immediately." Reclassified, Charles's tone sharpened. "Or erased." The man didn't answer. He simply adjusted his coat. "You're walking on ground that was never meant to be disturbed, Your Majesty. For your sake and for the monarchy's, let it rest." He turned to leave. But before he reached the door, Charles said quietly, "And if truth refuses to rest," the man paused, "then it will be buried with you, sir." The door closed. The echo lingered long after. Charles remained still, staring into the fire as it crackled and whispered like an ancient conspirator. He reached for the folder and opened it slowly. Inside, photographs, places, and a single page stamped in red, He frowned, scanning the first few lines. It spoke of meetings between British envoys and Middle Eastern scholars in the 1950s, an attempt to build bridges through faith, diplomacy through understanding. But it had been buried, discredited, hidden, and there, in faded ink, was his mother's signature. He read her words, trembling slightly, of, "If the East and West could see through each other's eyes, for one day the wars of empire would cease. But they prefer blindness to peace." A satyr welled in his eye, not of sorrow, but of fury. "They destroyed her too," he whispered. Even in death, he stood walking toward the window. The rain had begun to fall harder, tapping against the glass like restless ghosts. Across the street, a black car sat parked, engine idling. Watching, he knew the cost of truth. He had seen it consume men stronger than himself, but this was different. This was legacy. He picked up a pen and began to write, not a speech, not a decree, but a confession. A message to a world he knew might never forgive him. He wrote about the letters, the archives, the manipulation of faith for power, the silent wars waged not in deserts or cities, but in minds hours past. The fire dimmed to embers. When dawn crept through the curtains, the king was still writing, his hands steady, his eyes alive with something rare defiance. By morning, London was no longer silent. News channels buzzed with the leaked footage, commentators argued, politicians fumed, and millions across the world replayed that moment where the king had uttered the words, "Islam was never the enemy." Ignorance was. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace. Some carried banners of support. Others demanded abdication. The church issued statements of concern. The government remained silent. Though silence in times of storm speaks louder than any speech. Inside the palace, the corridors filled with whispers. Servants walked lighter. Glances darted quickly. The monarchy had cracked, not visibly, but in its soul. Charles sat alone in his private chapel. The candles flickered weakly as he whispered a prayer, not of repentance, but of clarity. "If I have sinned, let it be for truth," he murmured. "If I fall, let it be with eyes open." The door creaked. It was William, his face pale, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "Father," he said sharply, "what have you done?" Charles turned slowly. "What I should have done years ago. You've jeopardized everything, the crown, the family, our safety." William's voice cracked. "They're calling for your resignation. Do you understand that?" And Charles smiled sadly. They should. Maybe the crown needs to be rebuilt on truth, not tradition. William's jaw tightened. "You sound like a revolutionary, not a king." "I sound like a man who's tired of pretending," Charles replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension between them hung heavy, stretching across bloodlines and history. Finally, William whispered, "They won't let you continue, not after this." "I know," said Charles, standing, "but they can't unmake what's already been spoken." As William left, he paused at the doorway, his voice softer. "They'll come for you, Father. You know that?" Charles nodded. "Let them. I've been their prisoner all my life. Perhaps freedom begins with exile." That night, the king disappeared from public view. Official reports said he was resting due to health concerns, but those who had seen the flicker of rebellion in his eyes knew better. Rumors spread that he had been moved to Balmoral under watch. Others whispered of a quiet confrontation within the palace, a deal made behind closed doors. But no one knew for certain until one morning, 3 days later, a letter surfaced, unsigned, unsealed, but unmistakably his. It appeared in the inboxes of journalists across the world. The subject line read simply, "For the people." The letter was long, poetic, sorrowful. It spoke of faith, manipulation, and the courage to question. It revealed fragments of the suppressed archives, the letters his mother wrote, the truth about Project Lyra, and it ended with a line that would haunt the world forever, "If a kingdom fears truth, then it was never built by gods." The monarchy went into lockdown. The letter vanished from the internet within hours, but the damage was done. Screenshots spread like wildfire. The truth, once whispered, was now roaring through every corner of the world. Some hailed him as a visionary, others called him a traitor, but deep down everyone knew the veil had been lifted. Weeks passed. The palace issued carefully worded denials. The church called for prayers of unity. The press turned the scandal to spectacle, yet beneath the noise, something profound had shifted. A seed had been planted in hearts, in minds and history, and then quietly reports emerged from Scotland. Locals near Balmoral claimed to have seen candlelight glowing from the chapel late at night, a lone figure kneeling, sometimes praying, sometimes writing. No cameras, no guards, just a man stripped of crown and title, surrounded by silence and scripture. One villager, an old woman, swore she saw him one morning at dawn, walking barefoot through the mist toward the hills. She said he looked peaceful, lighter, as if he had finally laid down the weight of an empire. But when asked if she spoke to him, she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "He looked like a man speaking to someone higher." And so the story lingered, half-truth, half-myth. Some believed he had fled. Others believed he had been silenced. But there were those who whispered that the king had found something far greater than power, something his ancestors had feared all along. In an age of lies, he had chosen to speak the truth. And though the world may one day forget his words, the echoes of that night, the trembling confession beneath the studio lights, the letter, the defiance, will forever haunt the walls of every throne built upon silence. For truth, once awakened, does not die, it waits, it watches, it returns.